Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Jeff Saks of Atid and the Web Yeshiva, joining you live in front of a live studio audience. Clap so they hear you at home. They can't see you. Joining you in front of a live studio audience at the Beit Agnon in Jerusalem, at Agnon, Shai Agnon's house, for the first of our four-part series on, there he is, on Shai Agnon's novels. Now, I know many of you have been here for our sessions in the past or been online with us in the past, but just for those of you here in the house, who is this? Is this your first time here? Oh, how nice. That's a nice turnout of first-timers, so we're glad to have you here, and maybe we'll arrange, if you're going to come back. We had the nickel tour beforehand, but maybe we can arrange next time people want to come early, we can have a tour of the house as well before the session. Shai Agnon, of course, I'm not going to do the full biography, but just a trip to Wikipedia will fill you in if you need that. But Agnon is born in, he always said 1888. In fact, he was born in 1887 in the little town of Buchach in Galicia. Who's a Galicianer? Don't be ashamed. Okay. I'm a Galicianer. In what's the Litvaks. We'll argue about which kind of gefilte fish you should eat. What's that? Freud was a Galicianer, and Freud was not born in Buchach. I'm certain Freud was not born in Buchach. I'm pretty certain. We can make a little friendly wager. Buchach is a small town in eastern Galicia, what today is part of Western Ukraine. The Western Ukraine. Buchach, in its literary guise, in its nom de plume of Shibush, is of course the setting of our story tonight, a simple story, and our story for next time, Oreach Natalalun, a guest for the night. Here at the house, they have this nice little catalog called Mare Makom. They sell it here at the desk. The Agnon House, I think every other year, organizes a trip to Eastern Europe, including, of course, to Galicia and Buchach. And they have this nice little photo album that's available, this little souvenir album with photos of Buchach. Here's a postcard from 1901, which is just shortly before our story is set. Of according to somebody who's on the Wikipedia checking out, Freud was born in the Moravian town of Pribor, which is today part of the Czech Republic. That could be, but you would have lost the bet. It's not technically, someone said a shtetl. Buchach is not technically a shtetl, it's a little larger than that. In the first decade of the 20th century, the decade in which our story is set, there were about 15,000 residents of Buchach, which makes it quite a bit bigger than a shtetl. A little over half of them were Jewish. So it was certainly old world Jewish town, but it's bigger than a shtetl. Sarah Greenberg, are you there? You don't seem to have a microphone, so I can't let you speak. But if you have something to say, we're happy to hear you. Perhaps Yehoshua, our tech support, can help Sarah out with a microphone. Agnon comes on Aliyah in 1908. He's a young man. He's 21 years old. He is immediately identified as a rising star in the new world of modern Hebrew literature. If we had more time, we would discuss this display here, for those of you here on the right, the display of Agnon's first book. Perhaps you read about it. It got a lot of coverage in the press in the last few weeks and months. Not his first publication, but the first story to come out in book form is a novella called V'haya Ha'akov L'Mishor. It's right now being translated, and the crooked shall be made straight. It'll be coming out next year in English translation, and there were only 50 copies printed. It was financed by and published by Brenner, who himself was a great star in the firmament of Hebrew literature. There's a picture, and there's an actual copy of one of the original 100-year-old publications. 1912, he leaves Palestine, as it was called then, to go to Germany, because he understood that he needed to kind of round out his general education. He didn't really have a general education. He grew up in a traditional rabbinic home even, although his father worked for a living in the fur trade. But Agnon had spent his entire childhood and adolescence studying Torah in the Beit Midrash, although his was a home where literature and poetry were permitted and appreciated. He was essentially had immersed himself fully in the world of Torah study, even though for a period of time in his youth he leaves traditional observance. He retains a deep connection to Jewish sources and Jewish learning, and he goes to Germany to study for a few years. It's not clear exactly how long he intends to go. Obviously, it did not appear that he was meant to be going for an extended period of time. But you know how it is. He got married. He had 2 children. World War I broke out. All the things that get in the way of people coming on Aliyah. And he ended up staying there for 12 years. During that time, he meets Shlomo Zalman Shokin. Shokin later becomes the publisher, the owner of the Haaretz newspaper here in Israel. At the time, he was a department store magnate, a self-made man in Germany, and he becomes Agnon's patron. From a young age, Agnon has a stipend to support himself, and he can dedicate himself fully to writing. Agnon was very blessed with 2 things. One was this relationship with Shokin, which meant that he was able to focus on his writing. When you think about other authors, Agnon's very often compared to Kafka, for example. But Kafka had 2 things not going for him. One is he had to work, and he worked at some menial, like mind-numbing job as a clerk in a bank or something, insurance company, worse than a bank. No offense to the insurance salesman. And I mean, you think that Einstein was also doing relativity. He was working as a clerk in a patent office, and he was doing theory of relativity at night on his own time. Although I guess he didn't have YouTube to distract him. I guess you could do a lot when you didn't have like Facebook to distract you. So Kafka had to do all of his writing on his own time. Agnon was able to dedicate himself fully to his craft, and unlike Kafka, who died around the age of 40 or something, like younger than I am, which I find very depressing, Agnon had a very long and active career. He had an active, Agnon was born in 1887, technically, and he died in 1970, and he was writing up until the end. A little less than a year before he died. He was still writing and working, and so he had an active writing career of over 60 years. So he was able to just produce a lot more. 1924, his house in Germany burns down, including his library and some manuscripts. He says, "That's it. It's a sign. We're going back to Israel. I'm going to shorten the biography and just tell you." 1966, he wins the Nobel Prize. So in between this and that, he was writing a lot of stuff. He wrote in an amazing variety of genres. Now, this is important because for our series, we're going to be talking about the novels. Those of you that have been with us in the past, we focused very much on the short stories. We did a couple of the novellas, which we had to break up over a few sessions. Tehillah, which is about 50 or 55 pages. It took us 3 hour-and-a-half sessions to get through that. Maseh HaEz, which is a short story of a couple of 100 words, it took us an hour-and-a-half to properly make our way through. Now we're going to talk about novels, some of which are 500 and 600 pages long, and we're going to do them in one session. So obviously, we're not going to be reading every word. Agnon, in his life, published 4 novels, and a 5th was published posthumously. So over the next 4 months, we're going to be talking about the 4 novels Agnon published in his life. We're not going to be doing them in chronological order. Tonight, we'll be talking about a simple story, Sippur Pashut. Next time, in a month from now, on Sunday night, August 5th, we're going to be doing the novel Oreach Nata Lalun. Those of you that want to brave it in Hebrew, it's for sale here at the desk. In English, it's called A Guest for the Night. It's available on Amazon. You can buy them used on Amazon or on Book Depository, or on Abe's Books, all these websites. You can buy these used books sometimes really very cheaply. Here in Israel, if you, in Stamatsky or in those bookstores, they'll usually order it for you if they don't have it in stock. It sometimes takes some time. I don't know how much it will cost. You can also check in all of the very many great used bookstores that we have in Jerusalem, and sometimes in libraries. I know that in our library in Efrat, they have the books, and I think sometimes even more than one copy in English. Someone mentioned here that the AACI library in Jerusalem also had at least some of them. So you know, there are ways to get the books. I'll put up a couple of sample chapters up on the website, and for those that would like to get them by email, I'm happy to send them also by email. The hope is, I guess, that if you could read the novels in advance, that's great. If not, you can use our talks together as a kind of like framing to help you get into the novel. If you can read them in Hebrew, even better. And if you just want to come and enjoy the talk, well, you're welcome to do that also. But if somebody really wanted to undertake reading these 4 novels, and I've spaced them so they get progressively longer. The last one is the longest. So if you say, I'm really only going to read one of these 4 novels, so read the last one, which is going to be, in English it's called Only Yesterday. In Hebrew it's called Smol Shel Shom. But it's a hefty, big novel of a couple hundred pages. That was the last novel published in his lifetime. The novel that was published posthumously a year after he died is a novel called Shira, which even when it was published a year after he died was technically not complete. It has a kind of incomplete ending. I think a year after it was published, it was republished with additional material that was found in the archive that his daughter didn't have when she initially published it. And so in the translation of Shira, they have all that additional material also translated. There is one essay that I recommended. It's on the website. Those of you here, if you come up to me afterwards, I'm happy to send it to you by email. An essay by the critic Dan Miron it's called Agnon's Transactions with the Novel, or Domesticating a Foreign Genre, where he suggests that Agnon had a little trouble with the novel as a literary form, the long novel as a literary form, because it's very un-Jewish. The novel. Agnon, when you think of some of the stories we've read before, which are really taking the guise of, in some cases, the guise of a midrash, or the guise, think of the story Agunot, the title story, the first story published, from which he takes his pen name, Agnon. It's really, you read it, it's almost like a midrash, or a story like, well, V'hayakov Lamishor, which we were talking about a moment ago, which is really like a Hasidic tale. Now, it's a Hasidic tale cast as modern literature, or rather, it's modern literature cast as a Hasidic tale. Some of you may remember the first session that I taught here a couple of years ago on the short story Etrogo Shel Otot Tzadik, that Tzadik's Etrog, from which Shuli Rand expanded and made the movie Ushpizin, which I know many people saw, which is based on an Agnon story based on Hasidic lore. And he's taking it and he's kind of recasting it as modern literature. Those were genres that he, in one way, felt more comfortable. And the novels, there's something about the novel form that Miron at least suggests bothered Agnon. And that leads to some interesting things. We'll see one of them hopefully by the end of the evening. And in fact, it appears in different ways. But this one essay, if somebody wants to read one piece of criticism, of parshanut, of commentary on Agnon, so I recommend this essay because it'll cover all the different novels that we're going to be talking about. And again, if you'd like, I'm happy to email it to those of you that are here. Each of the 4 sessions, I hope that we'll cover each of the novels. Obviously, we can't do everything altogether. I hope it'll give you a little grounding, a little background to what we're doing. Hopefully, it'll inspire you to. Somebody said to me that I have a very skewed idea of what summer beach reading is. If I think people are going to be sitting with like an Agnon novel, but But okay, why not? Unfortunately, the novels, I don't think they're available for e-readers or Kindles or things like that. I'm not sure. I don't think, maybe one of the later ones. Maybe Smol shall show them. No, not even that. I don't know. But I hope that also we're going to vary the format a little bit. I hope maybe you'll see as we move along tonight, hope we'll invite some people in. It won't just be me. And of course, those of you that did endeavor to do the reading, we're interested in hearing what you have to say for the novels. And those of you that, didn't do the reading, you probably still think you have what to say. So that's fine. Sippur Pashut, a simple story. The title itself is of course confusing. It's interesting. It was written in 1935 and only translated 50 years later. It's curious why some of the most important things that he wrote sat untranslated. Some of them are still untranslated until today, and other things which are, we don't grade Agnon, but other things that you would think wouldn't be the most significant works, they were translated. So this is, according to all opinions, one of his most significant pieces of writing. Took 50 years to translate it, but I guess that's fortunate because some of the earlier translations weren't always great. This is a great translation by Hillel Halkin, although all of the translations, all 4 of the novels we'll be looking at, each one was translated by someone else. And therefore, they're uneven, but they're also different. Each translator wrestles with the tension between translating Agnon literally versus translating him lyrically. How do you capture the poetry of the Hebrew? How do you capture the resonances and the rhythms and the echoes of the Bible and the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Midrash, that if you are conversant in those sources and you're reading Agnon, you're hearing the echoes, you're catching the references. But in translation, you could be the biggest Talmid Chacham in the world. You could know the whole Torah backwards and forwards. And if you're reading in translation, sometimes those sources are going to go over your head because you're not catching the references, to say nothing of someone who is ignorant of the sources. So the translation by Hillel Halkin, one of our greatest living translators today, is really quite a good translation, although he does take liberties here and there. For example, there's a mention. First of all, just who's read the novel or who's reread it recently? Right. So there's the piece that I sent. So those of you that reread it, you'll remember, if you read it in English, you remember there's a reference to Freud. We were talking about Freud a minute ago, which doesn't surprise us in a novel which is, part of it takes place in a sanitarium. In a mental clinic, a clinic from it's not an insane asylum. It's a clinic for a mental health clinic. What we would call today a mental health clinic. But in the Hebrew, Freud is not mentioned. No, it's a liberty the translator takes. In Hebrew, Agnon calls him. Did anybody read the Hebrew? In Hebrew, Agnon calls him the Bal HaChalamot, right? The master of dreams. Right, which is of course the Bal HaChalamot. Who's the Bal HaChalamot? Who's the original Bal HaChalamot? Yosef from the Bible. He has the dreams, and he's right. So in other words, the master of dream interpretation from Vienna. But the translator takes a liberty and spells it out for you. It's one of the choices a translator is going to have to make. Halkin has this very nice. If you want to read one piece of criticism on this story, Halkin has this very nice afterword to the piece, and he starts off with the question, what does the title mean? What does it mean that it's a simple story, Sippur Pashut? Anybody want to venture a thought? Those of you online or those of you here? There's a Yiddish translation. In the 50s, there was a translation into Yiddish, one of the few cases of Agnon's work being translated into Yiddish. And in Yiddish, it's called a Pashut Amaisa, literally a simple story. But what does the title mean, a simple story or a Sippur Pashut? So Sarah says, seemingly simple. He's being ironic, right? He's being ironic. it seemed like a simple story, when in fact it's really rather complex. But what else might it mean? So maybe it means so that on the pshat, right, on the level of pshat, it actually is a quite simple story. And even those of us that read Agnon in Hebrew but struggle with the Hebrew will admit that reading this story it's simpler read, like just to make our way through it. Just to make our way through it. It's a simpler read than some of Agnon's more complex writing. It's meant to be, these beeps that you're hearing are the people sending in their comments and chats. So you just learn to ignore it. I mean, I shouldn't ignore it, but you all can. Let me just see what people are writing. All right, so Sherry says the vocabulary is easy, but it has great depth. But it's also possible. And some of the early critics pointed this out, that what does it mean Sippur Pashut? Doesn't mean simple. It means a Sippur Shehit Pashet, right? A story that's like expansive. Like the word Pshat, Pashut, can mean simple, or it can mean, to expand. It starts with a simple tale, right? A distant relative comes to live under the roof of her wealthy relatives because she's been orphaned, and from a seemingly simple thing, the whole thing starts. It snowballs, right? So Sippur Pashut might also be kind of like the tale that snowballs and gets more complicated and more complex. The one domino falls, in this otherwise very well crafted household of Cyril Horowitz, and suddenly, like when you pull one thread from a tapestry, the whole thing starts to unravel until you end up in a mental asylum. And not just that, but the shanda for the family and the everything else. On another plane, maybe it means that it's simple in the sense that it seems so effortlessly told. And then, of course, obviously, there's an ironic level. It's simple. Well, is there any story of heartbreak that's simple? Well, I imagine that someone in the audience at some point in their life suffered heartbreak. We're not, this isn't, Oprah, you don't need to come up and tell us your story. But let's imagine that someone suffered heartbreak sometime. Everybody's saying, what? But in other words, what is it? How old is Herschel when the story opens? 16, then 17, 18. These are young people, right? Teenage love, right? So it seems simple. Maybe when you look back with distance, you say, well, yeah, but it's her stories also. But her story, we know a lot less about. As we'll get into that, and we'll get into that in a second. The story itself, of course, is not autobiographical, but very often there's an autobiographical layer superimposed. Herschel's biography and Agnon's biography share nothing, except for the fact that it takes place in the same town. If we assume that Shibush is in fact Buchach, Shibush means what? Mishubash. Confused, broken. It's a town which is kind of something broken about it. There's something broken, muddled about the society. So this pun that he used, the literary pun that he uses when talking about his own town, Buchach, by calling it Shibush, right? He's like calling it like it's like a little mixed up town. It's a satire that he stopped using when writing about his town after the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, he never referred to it again in writing as Shibush. You said a town in transition? Why transition? Oh, oh, I see. So it's, I'm sorry, your name again is? Ralph points out that it's part of the shibush, or part of what's getting mixed up, is the old order, which is certainly an order of tradition, of control, of certain socioeconomic assumptions, which is everything is going on. And in fact, Baruch Shekivanta, Baruch Kurzweil, the great, really the first great literary critic of Agnon, has an essay called Ba'ayat Hadorot, the problem of the generation gap. I mean, if we would translate it today, we'd call it the generation gap in Agnon's writings, which is about this story. And he points out this story, and a lot of Agnon's writing, is about this transition from a traditional age to modernity, with all of the complications that are wrought through that transition. So our story, simple story, has this whole subtext of a society, of a town, on the verge of collapse. Of course, it's written in 1935. It's not clairvoyant of what's going to be coming. It's written in 1935 about events that took place 25 years earlier. It's obviously not, he could not have predicted what was going to be happening in Europe in the few years after the story is written. It was published in 1935, but it was written shortly before. Yeah, shortly before. Yeah, we have the letters. Part of our knowledge of when things were written, we have letters. Part of this arrangement with Shokin was he had to publish and he had to produce. So we know he's reporting, I'm working on this story, I'm working on that story. So it was published in the year, it was written in, over the year or two beforehand. It was initially published as a freestanding book called Sippur Pashut. It was later then in the Hebrew. It's now in many times there were a few different versions of the collected writings that came out. But according to whatever the last definitive version, the one that we all have, it appears in this volume called Al Kapot HaManul, at the handles of the lock, which is of course a pasuk from Shira Shirim, from the Song of Songs, which is of course an allegory of love. Shira Shirim, it's a story of the lovers. They're having trouble connecting. It's a metaphor for God and the Jewish people. Al Kapot HaManul, at the handles of the lock, at the doorstop. Like he's waiting for her. It's an image that appears in, if you've reread Sippur Pashut, it's an image that appears in our story, and from that he takes the title for the whole collection, which is a collection of love stories, but not the kind of love stories we generally think of when we think of love stories. An agnonic love story is something else. I'll come back to that in a second. The subtext of our novel, just to go back a second, is this idea of the society on the verge of collapse, of revolution, of transition, and what are the different, how do you see that in the novel? What are the different elements of this that you see? A little bit you see the breakdown of kind of religious norms. Not so much, I mean, you do see these rebellion, people, Jews who are no longer observant, but also just Jews who are no longer interested. They're just disconnected from traditional life. Yeah, or they want to go to America. This idea that there are people from Shibush that are going off to America, the Golden Medina, where it's obvious if you go to America, there are those. The old room. I mean, he doesn't make reference to it, but you drop your tefillin, off the boat because you won't be needing it. But there are other elements. Is that what she does? Does she? By the end of the story, she hasn't yet gotten married, but she's a poor orphan working as a maid She doesn't have very many options. She has the Getzelstein on the doctor. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Do you have the book in front of you? The page numbers are all the same. So, are we supposed to hear the other? So someone in the audience is commenting that Bluma, there's a difference between the way Bluma and Herschel react. Herschel, at the end of the day, acquiesces to his parents or to his mother's kind of dictates, while Bluma strikes off on her own. I raised the question about that, and we're trying to get the judge's ruling by finding a court. But in the novel itself, we see these two major modern movements in Jewish life: socialism and Zionism. And which of them is considered real? Not Zionism. Socialism. Socialism is viewed by the kind of bourgeois, upper middle class, or wealthy family like the Hurwitzes to be very dangerous. To be very dangerous, not just because it makes the servants uppity, which it does, but because it calls into question the whole social order in which we, the Hurwitzes, are on top. And, you know, like this little shop boy, Getzelstein, the socialist, and his hunchback sister, and he thinks it can't be. It can't be. Zionism is not considered to be very dangerous. Herschel is sent off to the Zionist club, which is a kind of moadon. It's hard to describe exactly what it was. It was a place you'd go to read the newspapers, to hang out, whatever. But Cyril, his mother, is not afraid that he's going to take it seriously. He's not gonna, it's like the story about like the kid who comes on Aliyah. The kid goes home one day and tells his parents, I'm going on Aliyah. I'm moving to Israel. Parents say, where did you get such a crazy idea? So the kid says, what are you talking about? You sent me to Zionist schools. You sent me to Zionist camp. We went to Israel for vacations. We marched in the Israel Day Parade. What do you mean, where did I get the idea from? I got it from you. And the parents said, we didn't think you'd take it seriously. So Cyril certainly doesn't think that Herschel is going to take it seriously. But this question, this subtext of the generation gap runs throughout the novel and throughout a lot of Agnon's writings. Now, this story as a love story, well, is it a love story? Well, what do we think of when we think of a love story? How does a love story end? I don't mean that movie by the same title. Consummation, they lived happily ever after, ends with a wedding, a romantic love, happily ever after, right? Romeo and Juliet isn't a love story, it's a tragedy. No, first of all, in Shakespeare, there are very, very, very clearly delineated genres. Love story is not one of them. They're histories, they're tragedies, and they're comedies. You know you're watching a comedy because? No. Because it ends with a wedding. And you know you're watching a tragedy because it ends with a funeral, right? And the only thing funny in the tragedy is the gravediggers, right? The gravediggers are often the comic relief. You have that also, by the way, in Agnon. You have a few graveyard scenes where they're taking a page from Shakespeare. The gravediggers themselves are the comic relief. Agnon has a long short story called Shnei Talmidei Chachamim Shahayu Be'irenu. Two Torah sages from our town who don't get along, they fight as a machloket. And it's also a tragedy. It ends with this graveyard scene. There are these two gravediggers. One is very tall and one is very short. The tall one's name is Chaim. Because he's very tall, they call him Chaim Aruchim. I can't translate it. If you don't get it in Hebrew, I can't translate it. The short guy, his parents had no children, you know, there's a minhag. If parents didn't have any children and then they have a child would sometimes be named Kaddish, because he would say, he'd be the one that would say Kaddish, or whoever the last child, if you have a Ben Zkunim, Kaddish. But he was very short, so they called him Chatzi Kaddish. So, so I apologize to those that don't get the joke. It's not translatable. So in Agnon, yeah. Oh wait, we're going back to the. I'm sorry. What's your name? Your name, Barbara. On page 152. Let me read it because so that the people online can also. So page 152, the end of chapter 23. Whom did she think she was waiting for? Did she really believe some wealthy young man would still come along and marry her? We're talking about Bluma. The fact was that having been unlucky with one once, Bluma wanted no more mothers or fathers' boys, whether they dreamed of Zion or of the millennium. Once, long ago, she had given her heart to a young man named Herschel Hurwitz, not because either of them planned it that way, but because one day when she grew up, there he was. Herschel, who could have been her twin, more on that in a second. Anyone knowing the two of them might have wondered, as indeed Cyril did, why they should have been meant for each other. Anyone less clever than Cyril ever must have felt a twinge of pity at seeing the two cousins parted. Okay. I may have been unlucky, she said, but I landed on my feet. Okay, I accept that. I accept that. Any other? Well, I mean, how can you agree with or disagree with it? You can't disagree with Agnon. Here it is, black on white. Okay, so Barbara's point that Bluma makes certain choices, that she's in some ways takes an independent stand, and Herschel, there's nothing independent about him. He's the most passive. I mean, literally, the narrator describes him as literally as putty in the hands of his mother to be molded the way that she wants. You know, but you have that very often in Agnon. Very often in Agnon, the women are the active players, the men are the passive players. But in Agnon, in a love story, there are no happy love stories in Agnon. Agnon takes his name, Agnon, his pen name. Agnon, of course, was not born Agnon. He was born Shmuel Yosef Chachkis, was his birth name. Everybody always giggles. You say the name Chachkis. And as was the fashion in the second Aliyah, people Hebraize their name. His first published story in Hebrew, when he gets to Eretz Israel, is a story called Agunot. Now, it's not really about Agunot, what we talk about in conventional language. An Aguna, of course, is not even what we refer to an Aguna. An Aguna in the Talmud is a woman whose husband disappeared. He travels, he's off at sea, and he just disappears. We don't know what happened to him. Because we don't know what happened to him, there's no evidence one way or the other that he died, even though he's gone for however many years. She is not permitted to remarry in the absence of a divorce. Colloquially today, there are fewer of those kinds of cases. But colloquially today, we refer to the situation in which the halacha basically does not allow a woman to initiate divorce. So a nasty, rotten husband, recalcitrant husband, can basically chain his wife and deny her a divorce, and she's stuck. So in Aguna, although this is not technically the etymology in modern Hebrew, in Ogen is an anchor. So an Aguna is like an anchored woman, a chained woman. She's stuck. The story Agunot is not really about that. It's about a different type of igun. And all of Agnon's love stories are about this different type of igun. A kind of situation in which the intended can't get together. Something is separating them. And sometimes there's this desire in the next generation to try to make it right, but that doesn't always work. If anybody's read, Agnon has another story which is referenced here. The story in Hebrew it's called Bidmeya Meha. In English it's translated as In the Prime of Her Life. It's a story of Tirza and Akavia Mazal, who are referenced in passing in this story. It's the house to which Bluma when Bluma leaves the Hurwitzes, she goes to work as the housemaid in the house of this Akavia Mazal, who's referenced here and there. It's the house on whose lock Herschel goes and like rests longingly, looking to see maybe Bluma will be coming out of the house. That's also a story of a man and a woman who can't quite get it together. You remember, I mean, Agnon scholars amongst you give us other examples. The Hayakov Lemishor. Correct. That's there. It's a more technical aguna. The husband disappears. He's presumed dead. The rabbi allows the wife to remarry based upon mistaken evidence that the husband is dead when in fact he really is alive. She gets remarried, has a child. She had been childless before. The original husband kind of disappears in order not to cause the complications that would prevail were he to reappear. And he's a Kohen, it's even more complicated, right? Tehillah, remember Tehillah? Right? What's the source of all of Tehillah's problems, of all of her suffering, of the curse that she carries with her? No, some of you studied Tehillah with me here not so long ago, less than a year ago. Yeah, that her shidduch, her original intended shidduch, 90 some odd years, 92 years ago, she's 104, when she was 11 years old, she was mishudechet, she was matched to Shraga. They were going to be married in a year from now when he's bar mitzvah and she's bat mitzvah. And the father breaks the shidduch. Why? Because it turns out that they're Hasidim. And it can't be that we'll let our daughter marry a Chassid. The story is set, this part of the story is set in the beginning of the 19th century. And this causes a curse to fall on her, and all the tragedies of her long life go back to this curse. And the whole story is about her trying to rectify the situation. Sherry points out Agnon's parents themselves were a mixed marriage. His mother was a daughter of Misnagdim. His father was a Chassid, but by the time his parents got married, it was a long time later, and things were less problematic. But Agnon himself was a mixed marriage because his wife was a Yeke and he was a Polish Yid, and his in-laws did not like that at first, even though he made something of himself in the end. So this idea of these kinds of these love stories which are mishubashim, which are broken up, which are muddled, and have to somehow either be repaired or attempted to be repaired, and that's part of our story. How does it play out in Sippur Pashut? Well, let's just run through the bones of the plot for those of you who haven't read it. The widow Muriel lay dying. It begins with the death scene of Muriel leaving her daughter Bluma. In English, he translates Bluma as, he writes Bloom, B-L-U-M-E. In Yiddish and in Hebrew, Agnon writes it Bluma. Bluma. What? H. Why? I don't know. We can email Halkin and ask him why he chose to call her Bluma. But Bloom, because in other words, in her name Bluma Nacht. Bluma means in Yiddish a flower. So probably he chose to translate it as bloom to catch the connotation of a flower which blooms, even though it's spelled differently. I don't know. We can email Halkin and ask him why he chose to do it that way. Bluma Nacht, the night flower, this kind of, Nightshade, this beautiful girl, and she's described as a beautiful young girl. It's actually here at the house 2-3 years ago, there was an exhibit here. There's Michlelet Emunah, there's this college, this college for religious women, young religious women, this artists college. They study graphic design. It's right here. It's near, a couple blocks away. So they had an exhibit where the students, having had learned some Agnon as part of the regular curriculum, part of their assignment was to draw portraits or paint portraits of an Agnon character, so that their painting itself would be a form of commentary. So there was an exhibit here of the final paintings, and these are some of the. This is Cyril. I'm not sure that I completely agree, but there's one thing for sure: anybody who's going to paint Cyril is going to paint her She was a zaftig lady. I mean, even the description of her appetite and her desire to eat and etc. And here's Bluma. Right? So I don't know how I envisioned her, but here she's a young, 16. I am 16, going on 17. She's a pretty girl. And here in the background you have, I'm not sure who it's supposed to be. I assume it's her father. You can see here a little better. Right. So her father's kind of this old, sad critter, but you can see here. Whoever the artist is that painted this, I mean, her name is at the bottom. She's a pretty young girl. Fit to view. This is painted by someone named Shlomit Rosenberg, and here's Herschel, a little more nondescript, but this might have been what he looked like. Bluma's left orphaned. Muriel had originally been meant many years ago to marry her cousin, which was not uncommon that cousins would marry, to marry her cousin Baruch Meir Horowitz, who was also not from a wealthy family. He was an apprentice in the shop of Shimon Hirsch Klinger. What's the name Klinger mean? Like the clinking, the clanging of the coins, which plays very prominently in a scene which we're going to act out in a moment. But the Klinger house has a curse on it. What's that curse? A number of generations ago, a great-grandfather of Shimon Hirsch Klinger had made an insult to a local rabbi, and it said, because of that insult, in every generation in the Klinger family, there's one mishuga. Someone goes out their mind. And in fact, Shimon Hirsch Klinger has a son who goes out of his mind. Because of that, it's very hard to make a shidduch for his younger sister, for Tzirul. So Tzirul, what can he do? She needs a shidduch. So he's mashadech her. He makes a match with this shop boy, Baruch Meir Horowitz. And Baruch Meir Horowitz becomes the owner of the shop. He inherits the shop from his father-in-law and becomes one of the richest Jews in Shibush because he, a no one, someone not of rich and wealthy, had married Tzirul because they couldn't make a proper match for her. And because of this, he jilts poor Muriel, who marries instead Chaim Nacht. Chaim Nacht is a lovely fellow, but he's not so good in the business sense. And they live a life of poverty. He dies. When she dies, poor Bluma, a young teenage girl, is left alone an orphan, so she's sent off to these distant relatives, this cousin of her mother's, these wealthy Hurwitzes in Shibush, in order someone should care for her. She shows up on the first page of the story in chapter 1, on page 3. Where are we? Here. Bluma boarded the wagon. Sorry, let me just make a little. Bluma boarded the wagon and left for Shibush. When she reached her cousin's house, she sat down in a chair in the entrance hall with all of her belongings beside her. It's like it's like made for a movie. Like this pretty young girl, she had just got up from Shiva for her mother. She shows up, maybe she's got one little peckle of things, all of her worldly goods. On coming upstairs from the store that evening, Cyril Hurwitz saw a new face. What does Cyril mean? I mean, Cyril, there are people, I mean, I know people named Cyril, right? Anybody here named Cyril? There's a woman in Alon Shvut named Cyril Hurwitz. What? What does the name Cyril mean in Yiddish? You know, Agnon very often did this. The name of the character itself is somehow a statement about the character. Cyril is like a jewel, like a piece of jewelry. Not exactly a trinket, but in other words, her name itself says, you know, materialism, which is, you know, if you've read the story, you know that's who Cyril is. So Cyril saw a new face. She took it by the chin between her fingers and asked, "Who are you, my dear? And what are you doing here?" Later we'll see this, that Cyril, she runs the store. They run a store. It's kind of like a general store, you know, type. I mean, even when I was a kid, they used to still have such things. A general store, housewares and dry goods and things like that. And it says how she kind of, you know, every time once a customer walks in the store, he becomes like putty in her hands. And even a little kid will come in, she'll grab him by the chin, because she knows now he's little and his needs are little, but soon he'll be big, and so will his needs be big. So this sense of grabbing by the chin is itself a kind of way, you know, like the way you'd, I mean, the way you'd, you know, size up a horse in the market, or a slave. Right? You know, kind of, you know, you grab it by the chin, take a look. What are you doing here? So Bloom stands up. I'm Chaim Nacht's daughter. Now that my mother is dead and I have no parents, I've come to you because you're my family. Cyril pursed her lips and said nothing. Bloom looked down on the floor and reached for her bags as though they were all she had to take hold of in the world. And in fact, they are all she has to take hold of in the world. Cyril sighed. Oh, it was very sad to hear about your mother. May she rest in peace. I never met her, but I'm told that she did not have an easy life. Well, you know, does Cyril know that this is the jilted intended of Baruch Meir? Probably. Not everyone is fortunate. Your father, too, was taken before his time. What a pity that was, because there was no better Jew than he. I've been told that he spent his whole life studying, and I suppose that he passed some of his knowledge on to you. I myself don't have much book learning, but I do hope that, and she's not saying that with any regret, right? Because book learning is not something that's at all practical for Cyril. I myself don't have much book learning, but I do hope that you were also taught a few things that a woman ought to know. Now, she runs one of the major businesses in town. And it's not like a kind of anti-feminist statement, but this idea that a woman needs to know what she needs to know to get along in the world, that we hope that you've learned, and not just this silly nonsense. So what happens, of course, is that Bloom is taken in as a maid in the house, and not on such great conditions, because if she was Stama maid, so she'd have to get paid. But she's not a maid, she's a relative, she's family, right? So it's a kind of bad situation. What happens, of course, is that, well, there's this wonderful scene. The next morning, she has a dream or a nightmare. She can't sleep. She gets up early, and she decides that she's going to go downstairs, Bluma, and she's going to prepare breakfast. She heats we're on page 6. She heated a saucepan of milk, coffee, sets out cups, saucers, spoons, knives, sliced bread, etc., etc. When Mrs. Hurwitz came down to make breakfast, she found it already waiting for her. Soon Baruch Meir appeared. Rubbing his hands, he said, "Good morning" to Bloom, lifting the tails of his jacket. You know, the way a good balabasi, he wears a long jacket, he lifts the flaps on the back, he sits down. He's also a man. There's a description of him at some point in Hebrew that as he reaches middle age, Evarav hosifu basar ubsaro hosif shuman. His limbs grew fleshy and his flesh grew fatty. You know, he's somebody who's come into proper middle age. Remember, they're not, as they have this 17-year-old boy, they maybe got married a little late, and Herschel, who's their only child, was born after a long wait. For a long time, they thought they wouldn't be able to have children, so they're already well into, you know, reaching middle age, and he's, you know, as happens sometimes to people in middle age, he's a healthy fella. So he sits down at the table, he pours himself some coffee, regards his cousin and the cakes she had brought with approval. He was followed into the dining room by his son Herschel, who declared, "Those cakes look awfully good." He took one of them, ate it, and said, "These deserve a special blessing. These are really, really good cakes." "Who baked them?" asked Cyril, breaking off a little piece and tasting it. "Did you?" "No," Bluma said, looking at her. She too tasted a piece. "But I can bake just as good. They're the leftovers from the Shiva." In other words, the day before she got up from Shiva and got on the wagon and went to Shibush. "No," Bluma said, looking at her. She too did. "Thanks be to God," said Cyril, her tone of voice changing, "that we aren't cake eaters and pastry nibblers here. Plain ordinary bread is good enough for us." Bloom looked down at the table. The munching of cake did not stop. "Mama dear," said Herschel, leaning towards his mother, "I have something to say to you." Cyril looked at his son. "Then say it. It's a secret." Cyril bent an ear toward him. Herschel put his mouth to it as though intending to whisper, and said in a loud voice, "You must admit, Mother, that these cakes are delicious." So right away from the beginning, there's this tension between Cyril and Bluma. Cyril is someone who's used to having her cake and eating it too, of being in control, of molding everyone, quite literally like putty, and of course, when it comes time, when she becomes aware that Herschel has eyes for Bluma, she knows this won't do. She knows this won't do. And there's this scene in chapter 7. Bakol, why don't you join me here? We're going to act it out. We're going to act this one out. Cyril realizing, why don't you sit here? Here, what? So you have to sit a little closer. Cyril realizing that this just won't do, that he cannot marry Bluma. Bluma's poor, she has nothing. Ah. What's irony here? What? Cyril married Baruch Meir, who had nothing, because she had no options. But the hope was that Herschel would have options. She's been molding him his whole life, right? That idea that we all have, that we're the only force in our children's lives, right? That we alone can, kind of mold them exactly to the way we are. So lots of people. You don't need to be Cyril Hurwitz to kind of like live under that fiction from time to time, right? That we kind of like set a path for our children, and yeah, so she thinks she can do it. And this happens already from the. What's his name? What's Herschel's name? Minna, his wife, the woman he ultimately marries, calls him Heinrich, because it's a kind of a modernish thing to call him by his German name. But his name, how is he called to the Torah? Shimon Tzvi. He's named after his grandfather. He's named Shimon Tzvi after his grandfather. But it says early in the novel that the name Shimon fell away already while he was in the cradle. This happens sometimes. You give a kid a name, and you call him by his middle name. And Tzvi was short. Tzvi in Yiddish is Hirsch. But Tzvi in Hebrew is a deer. In Yiddish is Hirsch. And Herschel is given the diminutive Herschel, Herschele, right? And what's his name? He's given like two of the most masculine names that we have. Shimon. Who's Shimon in the Torah? Shimon and Levi. Not rebellious. He's the warrior's son. Shimon and Levi, they destroy Shem, right? Shimon, it's like naming him, I don't know, Hercules. Tzvi is a very Gavri name. It's a very strong name, right? So, but they take this very strong masculine name, and in the end, what's he called? Like, what would you call, if you had to translate it into English, what would you call him? Bambi. right? You call him like, so he's like completely emasculated, while his mother's like literally molding him like a piece of not clay but wax is what's used. Now she wants to make sure that he's not gonna, that she has to put an end to this whole idea of a love affair with Bluma, with this no one, and she has her eyes set on the daughter of the Tzimlichs. The Tzimlichs are this wealthiest family from this town, this village. In other words, around Shibush there were these villages. There were agricultural villages, and he's basically this Gedalia Tzimlich is in charge of this village, and he's nouveau riche, right? He's become very wealthy, and because they provide, the eggs, they're the major egg supplier for the whole region, and they're very wealthy, and they have this daughter who's been sent away to school and is cultured, and this Minna, and so she wants Herschel to marry Minna, the daughter of these people with whom they have this business connection. The name Tzimlich itself means means like so-so, right? So Minna, she said, there's nothing wrong with Minna. She's perfectly lovely, but she's no Bluma, right? That is Bluma Nacht, the night flower, versus right? So Cyril realizes that she has to work this all out, but Cyril still works within this kind of traditional framework where there's a shadchan, in this case Yonah Toiber. A Toiber is a dove, and a Yonah is a dove. So his name is Dove, right? Right? Like a set of lovebirds, Yonah Toiber. Lovey-dovey maybe, right? But Yonah Toiber himself is not so happy. But he's the town shadchan. You have to go through him if you want to make a shidduch. And she realizes, of course, that these things generally go through the father. So she's got to get Baruch Meir on the job. So there's this scene. It's on page. I'll read it for you, but it's chapter 7. I'll just set up the scene. They're in their shop. It's the end of the day. The shutters are half closed and half opened, and they can see from under the shutters the people walking past. Maybe it's a fine summer evening, and young lovers are out for strolls. But Cyril and Baruch Meir, they have no time for this. They're on page 43. They're in counting the money. Page 43. Silently, Cyril and Baruch Meir sat listening. What could they be straining to hear? A line of songs sung in faraway climes by the planters of such southern vines and trees? The last echo of a kiss that a shepherd gave his love beneath them? There were people in Shibush who swore that the apogee of true love was a certain rich lady in town who would run off with her butler, something very impetuous, breaking all the social norms. There were others who told you to look for it in the person of an unrepentant, but a different character. Still others insisted that only the man driven out of his senses by passion could claim to be love's acolyte. Things that are so foreign to a society of arranged marriages. What does it mean, romantic love? In each of these cases, the passion for love misled them about love itself. Cyril and Baruch Meir, in any event, had no time for such diversions. Baruch Meir never pretended to be Cyril's lover, and Cyril never drove Baruch Meir out of his senses. He simply was as happy with her as she was with him. Right? They got what they deserved. But do they love each other? No. Yes. Well, I mean, it's Golda and Tevye. Do you love me? Do I love you? Right? After how does it go? Right? What does he say? The first time I met you was on our wedding day. I was scared, I was shy, I was nervous, so was I. But my father and my mother said we'd learn to love each other. So I'm asking, do you love me? So she says, for 25 years I've cooked for you, cleaned for you, given you children, cleaned your house after 25 years. So I talk about love right now. Says, what is love? Yeah, they love each other. But it's a different conception of love. It's not this romantic running off night on a white horse love. And what's love? What could be more romantic than husband and wife sitting in their shop at the end of the day, counting out their money, clingering their coins, clinking their coins. Their days passed in the making of money, and if now and then they chose to rest from it, they generally did so in silence. Yet sometimes their silence was broken. When one has been hard at work, a bit of conversation can be welcome. Wait. So this is Bakol Geller, who's just playing my wife. In real life, we're not really married. Bakol is an actress, and those of you that have seen the Jest plays, you know her. But she also is involved in some of the things here at the Beit Agnon. So I'm just we're gonna act out this little dialogue between them. We're on the top of page 44, 45.
You know, no matter how far ahead you try to look, you never can look very far. If you're wondering what's on my mind, it's Gedalia Simlich's daughter. I do believe that she's suited for Herschel. Don't you?
Well, we'd better see what Teuber, the matchmaker, thinks about it.
I wouldn't dream of depriving Teuber of a livelihood, but I wanted to hear what you thought first.
Simlich has money, that's undeniable.
And Mina?
Mina's a lovely girl, that's undeniable too. It's just
Just what?
Just like in matters like this, you don't really need me. I believe you're a better judge of them than I am.
We're in perfect agreement, our mayor.
So what now?
Now the time has come to talk to Teuber.
That's just what I said.
So you did, Baruch Meir. I only wanted to know what you thought about it first.
We're in perfect agreement, Cyril.
A person should always seek advice. No one should make important decisions all by himself. One person will tell you this, another will tell you that, and little by little things sort themselves out. But just so you don't think I've been up to anything behind your back, I had better tell you that I've already spoken to Teuber.
So what did he say?
As if you didn't know Teuber?
I'd still like to know what he said.
He didn't say anything. He left the store.
Where did he go?
I personally did not follow him, but I heard that he was in Malachrawick visiting the Simlichs.
And what did he do there? Say some more nothing?
That is something we can ask him when he comes for his matchmaker speech.
Oh, we certainly shall, said Baruch Meir, rubbing his hands together, which is this, scene that you see him, doing throughout the novel. Thank you. Thank you. Herschel had fallen for Bluma. One of the interesting things, and this just by way of an aside, one of the interesting things in Agnon's narration, and one of the differences between the experience of reading the novel in Hebrew and English, not just this novel, but generally in Agnon, Agnon very, very, very rarely used quotation marks. I mean, this dialogue, when we were acting it out, we left out all of the he said, she said. Just what asked Cyril. It was obvious that Cyril was speaking, but the kind of direction that the author has to put in. But even during other parts, Agnon very rarely, if at all, will ever use quotation marks, and instead the narrator in the story, well, in this story, the narrator is this kind of, all-knowing figure. He doesn't have any action in the story itself. And as a matter of fact, we don't know if the narrator is telling us the story contemporaneous to when it's happening, or if it's a narrator looking back years in the future telling it. It really doesn't matter for the purposes of the story, as opposed to some other stories, like for example, Tehillah, where the narrator himself is an important character Well, in other words, there the autobiographical superimposition is very clear that the character of the narrator in Tehillah parallels very much Agnon himself. Agnon, being his normal coy type of self, used to claim that he would sometimes go and visit, that he, Agnon himself, in the real world, would go and visit Tehillah when he wanted to get away from other people. But it's obviously not it's not autobiographical. It's not an actual story that actually happened, although there were people that always wanted to claim that Tehillah was a real person, was based on a real person. We want her to be real. You know, if there's one character from Agnon we would like to think really walked the earth, it would be Tehillah. In other cases, the narrator plays an important role in this, but usually the narrator is this kind of, all-knowing, removed. But Agnon employs something which in Hebrew is called maba mishulav. In English, it's variously translated as narrated monologue or free indirect discourse, for those of you that have a degree in literature. What it means is that sometimes you're reading the narration and you don't know, is this Herschel speaking? Or is this the narrator telling you what Herschel's thinking? Or is it the narrator telling you what the narrator thinks Herschel is thinking? This is a way in which the narrator or the author can communicate the inner mind of various characters, portray the inner psychology of various characters, but do so sometimes in an ironic way. Because we don't know, is the narrator giving it to us straight? Is this really what happened? Because normally in a novel, think of like a detective novel. So the narrator, the author, if it's narrated, sometimes Sam Spade, the detective himself, is the narrator, telling you how the case unfolded. But sometimes there's a third-person narrator, an all-knowing narrator, who's going to tell you, the gun went off. But when they set up the crime in the beginning, they can't give it away to the reader, because part of the fun of reading a detective novel is that you also don't know who done it. And uncovering what happened as the plot goes along into the last chapter, whether it's Perot or whoever your detective is, explains the case, the Hardy Boys or whatnot. So the narrator has to tell you what happened without giving it away, but you assume that whatever the narrator is telling you, that's what happened. Right? The gun went off, so-and-so was hit in the head, dropped to the floor. But with Agnon, you never know what's going on, because Agnon is narrating for you the inner thoughts of various characters. If you're not working with this odd kind of narration, so usually the only inner thoughts that the reader gets are the inner thoughts of the narrator himself. And then all the narrator can tell you, the narrator can only give you the inner thoughts and feelings of himself. He can report to you, hearsay, that so-and-so said she was very heartbroken. But that's hearsay. We don't enter her mind. But the way Agnon presents it here and throughout much of his writing is this narrated monologue. Where you get it sometimes in Shakespeare also, where you'll have this soliloquy. What's the soliloquy in Shakespeare? Well, it's really a theatrical device that allows the audience to know what Hamlet is really thinking. But since different characters can give different soliloquies, the audience can be privy to the inner thoughts of different people. But it's a kind of odd, it's a theatrical convention that we accept, but in real life it doesn't work that way. Just like in real life, like in a musical. Like in a musical, you can have like a 3-minute musical number that conveys all different types of things that would take an author 20 pages to convey, or would take a normal film, a non-musical film, 20 minutes to convey. But in one musical, you can know, oh, he really loves her, but she doesn't know that. And think of big musical numbers. Think of great Hollywood musicals. right? In other words, that opening scene in West Side Story, right? It sets up the whole movie for you. You know, and however long that musical number is, you know who all the players are. You know, he loves her, she loves him. It's a star-crossed love. It's the Sharks and the Jets, and etc. The music, but in real life, we don't all break out into like this big dance number. It's a convention that we accept when we go to the movies. We go to a play. So here too, this device that Agnon does, where we enter the minds of the different characters, but the one mind that we don't enter all that much, although you point out one side, is despite that quote, we don't really get too much of an inner look into Bluma's mind. You don't really know completely what she's feeling, what she's thinking, and as a matter of fact, less than halfway through the novel, she basically disappears. Right? She disappears from the stage. Right? In other words, if we're casting the play, Bluma is not the lead female role. You're an actress. You don't want the part of Bluma, even though she's the most beautiful, because you have the least stage time. Right? Who do you want to play? Cyril. Here's a great question. It's like the extra credit question on the test. You're the casting director for the movie. Who do you cast as Cyril? Which actress, alive or dead, do you cast as Cyril? Carol Channing, do you say? Ethel Merman. It's not a musical. It's not a musical. And Bancroft. But she'd have to put on some weight. So. Meryl Streep can play anyone. Meryl Streep show, right? It's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. That's very. Someone in the audience is saying that Bluma is a kind of like an Esther character from Megillat Esther. This morning there was a Yom Iyun at Yad Ben Tzvi. They have every year they have an Agnon conference, and they have a few things. It's beautiful. If you've been to the Yad Ben Tzvi, you know, in Rechavia, they built this beautiful auditorium, 300 seats, really very nice. It was packed. There wasn't a seat free, and the author Chaim Be'er, who spoke here just a few weeks ago, he made a very, very nice presentation about Sippur Pashut, and he made a point of saying that Bluma is not Esther. You're close. She's Ruth from the book of Ruth, right? She's basically, who's Ruth? Basically, she's an orphan, a widow. In the case of Ruth, she goes looking for a goel, for someone to redeem her kind of sad life. But she goes to Yerushalayim, where things aren't mishubash, and she receives geula, she receives redemption, and from that comes the Mashiach, comes David HaMelech, and then ultimately the Messiah. But what happens to Bluma? She goes to the town that's all mixed up, where they can't get things right, where they can't fix things, and he went into greater detail, but it's an interesting, I don't know. I'm looking at just some of the comments here. Herschel's forced into this arranged marriage. Bluma, knowing what's what, leaves and goes to work in the house of Akavia Mazal. If we had more time, we would do a fuller comparison of that story in the prime of her life and this story, but there's a reason. Agnon very often did this. He built this kind of world of connections. In other words, in every story, there's like a reference to a different story. And we could map out almost every one of Agnon's stories and show the connection. That this character, the main character in this story, has a cameo appearance in the next story. As if to say he was painting the whole thing is one big story. It's one universe. It's one canvas that he's painting on. The two novels will do at the end, Hachnasat Kala and Tmol Shel Shom. The main character of Tmol Shel Shom is the Ben Bino Shel Bat Bito, the grandson of the granddaughter of the main character of Hachnasat Kala. And there's a reason for this. because in some ways the two novels taking place at two different ends of the kind of stream of Jewish history of which Agnon was writing about are mirror images of each other. Long story short, those of you that have read the novel know what's coming. That Herschel goes into a kind of depression. He doesn't eat, which is of course itself a form of rebellion, first and foremost against his mother. There's that fantastic scene where the engaged couple, where they go to the village for to meet with to have the in-laws. They have a big meal together. The in-laws and the young bride and young groom and the matchmaker, and the machtenis that comes for dinner the first time. You're not going to put on a show, and the description of the food. I've mentioned before many times that if for Agnon the food is just, if you want to satirize Jews, you show them eating. You show them eating, and food itself is a major motif that runs throughout the novel. There's that scene where Cyril pays back Herschel. Herschel doesn't want to eat. He's decided he's going to be a vegetarian. He's not going to eat. He can't eat. That sense that he's being forced into this marriage that he doesn't want. But finally, even he breaks. People do get hungry, and they bring out this pudding in the shape of a hat with sugar coins decorating it, and stuffed with plums and walnuts and whatnot. It's a kind of like corn pudding or something. And of course, it's decorated with money, right? Everything is money and food and eating and materialism, and the old rich and the nouveau riche, and this machatenister trying to outdo that machatenister. And finally, even Herschel can't take it, and he takes a big helping, a big slice of this pie or pudding or whatever it is, and he starts eating. And what does Cyril do? She leans over as if to whisper and says, "My Herschel, even you'll admit that this is tasty." She gives it back to him for what he had done the first morning that Bluma had come. He goes out into the forest, and I'm sorry it's a little late because we had a little bit of introduction. Just bear with me another 10 minutes or so. He goes off into the forest and he has a breakdown. He starts croaking like a frog. It's even more densely packed with motifs and symbols than that. There is this motif that runs throughout the novel of, well, those of you that read it, what are some of the major motifs and symbols that appear again and again and again throughout the novel? The forest. What? Well, the uncle, yeah. I don't know if that's a motif as much as it's an off-stage character. Shoes, correct. He goes crazy. What is he saying? Don't kill me, I'm not a chicken. Birds and chickens and everything related to fowl and eggs and etc. appear again and again and again and again. The meal, that breaking point, that meal where she brings out this kind of ceramic dish in the shape of a duck or a goose or something, and he goes crazy, and he's taken to the sanatorium of Dr. Langsam. Langsam means slowly, la'at la'at, and in fact this kind of odd treatment that he undergoes in this clinic of Dr. Langsam is slowly. There is, of course, in the literature on this novel, a lot that's been written from the psychotherapy perspective. What exactly is this? Is this a kind of bibliotherapy that he's going under? Langsam doesn't believe even in medicines. He only gives medicine so people won't think that he's a quack or won't think that he's a rebbe. What did people? My father-in-law, Zichrono Livracha, was a psychiatrist. So he said, had he been born, 150 years earlier, he would have been a rebbe. He would have been a Hasidic rebbe, which is like the same thing without a prescription pad, right? You go, you talk about your problem, talk therapy. You go, you talk about your problems, you get an eitzah, it helps you out, makes you feel good about yourself. It's a chicken soup. So it's not exactly bibliotherapy. He's not exactly a rebbe. And in fact, he himself, one of the most important pieces of commentary on this story, is a long, long essay by the same Dan Miron, called, in Hebrew, it's not, I don't think it's translated in English, called Harofeh Tzarich L'Refuah. The doctor needs a cure. That he himself is suffering. And it's hidden, not exactly between the lines, but it's tucked away, that he himself came from, not from Shibush, but also from a small town with its own provincial values. And although he left it, he has this nostalgia. And most of what they talk about is his own nostalgia for his own little town. You know, someone cue the tunes of Anna Tefka, Anna Tefka. We'll use Fiddler, we'll borrow the soundtrack from Fiddler as our soundtrack tonight. And his wife. What happened to his wife? She had committed suicide. Why? Because she used to read a lot of silly novels. Romance novels. And as a matter of fact, Langsom lends some of these novels to Herschel. And these novels put a weird idea in her head that she should run off and have a love affair. And it ended badly, and she ended up killing herself. And this is his psychiatrist, right? He's telling Herschel about his problems, and sooner or later Herschel comes to some kind of terms with his life. It's not spelled out exactly, but he comes to terms with the life that he is put in. His whole breakdown comes about, it happened to be Rosh Chodesh, he goes to shul, it's not written, but it's there between the lines. It comes about when he realizes, as most people do as they enter a certain stage of their life, that he was becoming like his father. That's sometimes an uncomfortable thing for people to, you know, come to terms with, that we each of us, one way or another, you know, evolve, you know, into our parents, for good and for bad, for good and for bad. It is seen that he's married now. Now he's working in the shop. He goes to shul on Rosh Chodesh, which is really, you know, for the middle-class shopkeepers, the only day they end up going to shul. We had been told earlier that that's the life of Baruch Meyer. And on the day that he snaps, it's the day that he's realized that he started evolving into his father. And Langsom helps him realize, without ever talking about it, it says explicitly, they never talk about Bluma, they don't talk about his problems, that the life of a middle-class bourgeois shopkeeper in an arranged marriage, there are worse things in the world. There are worse things in the world. Now, in the commentary, there's a lot of questions about what was this breakdown. And the narrator himself, the novel itself, is intentionally unclear. What is the source of his breakdown? No? So one is on a level unrequited love, heartbreak. He goes insane from heartbreak, or right. Well, those are symptoms of the right. Someone says no. His son, his eldest son, is born while he's there, after he's had the thing. So in other words, it could be. Well, first of all, on the level of the story, why does he go insane? It's in the DNA. It's a family curse. So it's a form of frustration, or it's a form of rebellion to go crazy. He had, a very little relationship with his wife, right? But when he comes back, when he comes back, well, this is the whole issue with sleeping and her breathing and etc. But when he comes back after he's been healed, so that begins to change. Well, it's one way he can escape from his mother. It's a form of sticking it in the eye of his mother. What could be the worst thing that could happen to Cyril, right? Right? Oh, the shanda, the busha. Right? What will people say? What will people think? Maybe they'll stop shopping in our shop. Right? There's also possible reading that he's not really crazy. Either he's not really crazy because maybe it suggested the whole thing is a ruse to dodge the draft, which was a very serious and a very real fear that hung over the lives of all young men in this part of Europe at that time. And maybe even the narrator suggests that he's not crazy. Well, who's the madman? Who determines what madness is? Someone that wants to marry for love? Is that madness? Right. In an insane asylum, the one sane person is the one that there's going to be consensus that he's crazy. Right? So maybe he's not. Maybe they're all crazy. All of these are plausible readings. It's part of the plurality of ideas that the novel suggests. And it's one of the beautiful things about Agnon is that every time you're going to read it, it's going to appear differently. Without sitting on Oprah's couch, I'll tell you, I read this novel for the first time as a 20-year-old coming off a deep adolescent heartbreak. You read it differently when you're in your 40s. There's one other element. And then we'll kind of close with this. And that's the idea of books. There's that scene at the beginning of the novel. Which is a flashback to Bluma's youth in the house of this lovely Chaim Nacht, but this low mutzlach Chaim Nacht. What's Chaim Nacht? What? In Chaim Nacht, he was her father, but he's not nightlife. He wasn't out going out to the bar. Nightlife, like life in the shadows, life in darkness. There's this beautiful scene. So he's a bookish person. He can't make a go of it in business. But they're happily married. He and Miral really do love each other. Right? I mean, just think of it, the two women, Miral and Cyril. So I'm sure there are people named Cyril. I'm sure they're all lovely. But just the not the onomatopoeia of it, but the Miral versus Cyril. Right? It's the names. The names convey something. Chaim Nach Kremner has it. True, there was not a flowery phrase. By then, Bluma was old enough to see and understand what was happening. Right? They've got nothing. They're poor. They can hardly eat. Her father sits around reading all day. She saw her mother stitching patch on patch to cover their poverty, and her father sitting by the window with an unread book in his hands, his blue eyes filled with tears and his silken soft beard clenched between his teeth. Sometimes he would take Bloom's hand and say, "I know, my darling, that a man like me, a husband and a father who can't provide for his own wife and daughter, should be sent to Siberia." And how he cried when he read her the story of the thief who was brought before the caliph. "Why did you steal?" asked the caliph. "Because," answered the thief, "my wife and children had nothing to eat." "I acquit the man of thievery," declared the caliph. "Now take him and hang him for having let his family go hungry." When the time came for Bluma to be given some education, her father took to sitting her beside him and reading together with her. "I know," said Chaim Nacht, "that I won't be leaving you any riches, that at least I'll have taught you how to read a book. No matter how black your life may be, you can always find a better one in books." So, here at the house, they have these little tchotchkes that they sell, so they have this bookmark with that quote on it, which unto itself is a very nice quote, although you'll see it's an ironic quote, right? Yodea ani biti she'eni manchil lach osher v'nechasim, aval ani milamdach likrot b'sfarim, bizman she'olamo shel adam chashuch ba'ado koreh b'sefer v'roeh olam acher. But what's he saying? What in fact is happening? There's this idea that, you know, your inability to deal with your life as it is, which is sometimes a tough life. It's a life of poverty. It's a life of unhappiness. It's a life of an arranged marriage, right? The escape to the book, like the wife of Langsam, sometimes leads you to places that you don't want to go or can't go or are dangerous. So what happens? Bluma was a quick learner. Almost before she knew all the letters of the alphabet, she was reading fairy tales and legends. Yet it astounded her father, who shed so many tears when he read that they all but rotted the pages, how little feeling she showed. None of the passages over which he was used to weeping or heaving a sigh, no one's suffering or sorrows seemed to move her at the least. A tragic tale that made him break down in sobs left her totally dry-eyed. But Papa, she might say when he tried explaining the full poignancy of the character's predicament, it's his own fault. If he hadn't done what he did, it would never have happened to him. Oy, Bluma, my Bluma, replied Chaim Nacht, how can any daughter of mine talk like that? A man does what he has to do. There isn't a thing we do or don't do that isn't already our destiny at birth. Meaning I'm poor because that's my destiny. And this actually, Barbara, this plays into that quote later. It plays in very nicely. I'd better go help Mama now. Bluma would interrupt him, right? Bluma is nothing if not practical, right? Whether she loves Herschel or not, and it's not so clear at the time that the time that Herschel's love is blooming, it's not clear what Bluma's feeling inside. That's a quote from later in the novel, right? But whatever it is, she's very practical. She has to be. She's a 16-year-old with nothing in the world. Right? At the end of the novel, when he returns and he's made peace for whatever reason, however it happens. They have the son. The son had been born while he was away. The son's not very well, so the son gets sent off to live with the grandparents on the farm where it's healthier living. This is the very end of the novel. Fresh snow fell on the gleaming white village, its smell fresh and gladdening too. Minna's little ears were frosty pink. They're going for a walk, Herschel and Minna. Yet after feeling frozen, they were now warm, and she soon saw that the cold was nothing to be afraid of. The two of them crunched through the snow, which seemed to sing beneath their feet. Or was it really the snow that was heard? Sitting cross-legged in it and strumming as he sang was a blind musician. And though he could not have been one of Langsam's beggars, Langsam had told him of the blind singers, the blind musicians of his town, as part of his nostalgic memory trip. But nevertheless, bounded, sad and sweet, seemed to have no beginning and no end. The song had no beginning. Yet Herschel and Minna soon stood perfectly still, as if waiting for him to finish it. Right? The sadness, right? This blind beggar is sitting in the snow playing a song that has no beginning and no end, because there is part of suffering in life. That suffering is part of life. And this idea, this romantic notion of dime store novels that happily ever after, it ends happily ever after, the end happily ever after, real life isn't like that. That's not the, Agnon is telling us, that's not the true purpose. That's not the high calling of literature. Literature is not to tell you they lived happily ever after. It's to help you look at the world that we live in and think about it in a more profound way. And the world that we live in is a world in which there's suffering, the song of suffering that has no beginning and no end. Suddenly Herschel seized Minna's arm and said, "Let's go." Had it not sent a shiver down her spine, she might have stopped to wonder at the harshness of his voice. They had already taken several steps when Herschel turned back and tossed the musician a coin. Had not the beggar been blind, he would have been amazed by the sight of it, for it was bigger than any coin that anyone had ever given him. Herschel's taken his place as a middle-class balabatish guy who makes his money, who clinks his coins, and according to the social customs will toss one, even a big one, to the blind beggar who's singing the endless song of suffering. He's kind of come to terms, he's made peace and takes his place in the bourgeois world. Ralph is going to disagree with me. You're going to... Oh, sad. Yeah. Well, why? Because what kind of novel is this? It's not a love story. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy, hidden as a love story. And then the novel ends. The new child is born, and now there's this kind of love between them, not unlike the love between Baruch Meir and Cyril. Minna, Herschel asked as they were standing by the baby's cradle, "What are you thinking about?" About his brother, the elder child, who's, I guess, being raised by the grandparents off in the village. "It's good that he's with your parents," says Herschel. "Yes," Minna said, "I think so too. But for a different reason than I do," said Herschel. "Why? What reason is that?" "That love can't be divided." "I thought," said Minna, "that it's the nature of love to always have room for one more." I mean, that's what we tell our kids, right? The kids say, "Who do you love more?" Right? Me or my brother, right? I love you both the same. So then you have a new kid. Well, now who do you love more? Don't you have to divide the pie somehow? No, it's limitless. Everyone has an infinity plus infinity. However many kids you have, infinity times that number. Herschel looked down and said, "No, that's not so, that the nature of love is to always have room for more. Love comes to us only when no one stands between it and us. He's given up Bluma. And having given up Bluma, now there's room for a different type of love with Minna. God in heaven knew that he was only thinking of the baby." And that's a point I didn't make, but throughout the novel, from the first page to the last, God in heaven is this device the narrator relies on to kind of raise questions of causality and what's going on and what's real. God in heaven knows that he was really only talking about the baby, but of course, what's he talking about? And then the novel ends. Herschel and Minna's story is over, but Bluma's is not. Why not? Well, because we don't know what happened to her. We have no idea. Everything that happened to Blumennacht would fill another book. And were we to write about Getzelstein, one of the other minor characters who was mentioned here only in passing, and about all the other characters in our simple story, much ink would be spilled and many quills broken before we were done. God in heaven knows when that will be. So the story ends. It doesn't end "They lived happily ever after," because it's not a love story. It doesn't even end "the end," because it doesn't end. Why doesn't it end? Because it's not to be continued. There were people that took him seriously in thinking that this was a promise that there would be a sequel. He was never going to write a sequel. That wasn't it. It's intended to say that that's the simple story. We take this. It's a song that never ends. Heartbreak and love sickness. It's the way of the world, and we can take a slice of it, like that slice of cake that he eats in that scene, and look at it. But the song keeps going on. The heartbreak keeps going on. And Bloom and Getzelstein and all these other characters, it's going to be the same thing. There's this line in the beginning where Herschel says something along the lines of that, he's come to realize that everything that happens through pain. Shehakol ba b'machov. That everything comes through pain. Everything comes through stuff. Suffering is the nature of life, and if you can come to terms with it, so then you can get along. And there can be no divided love. So it's not a happy story. It's a tragedy. It's quite a sad tragedy. What? That life is not simple. But he's saying in the kind of meta-artistic way that he often did, but that's the true purpose of literature. Literature is not about escapism, right? I can't imagine Agnon read any science fiction ever, right? You can go up to the library, I'm sure there's nothing on the shelves, right? Literature is about, confronting you with the issues, of real life. Issues like the conflict between tradition and modernity. Issues like the return to Eretz Yisrael. Issues like the breakdown, not just of traditional society, not just the spiritual breakdown, but the literal physical breakdown of 2,000 years of Jewish existence and creativity in the diaspora, which is the theme of the next novel. So for next time, Oreach Natal Alun, for August 5th, A Guest for the Night. It's a wonderful novel, although it has a very different origin of how it came about. There is a very serious autobiographical component to the story. The narrator is clearly meant to be some kind of projection of Agnon himself. It's actually based on a kernel of an autobiographical event that happened in his life, which is then, of course, expanded greatly for the purposes of the novel, and it is also set 20 plus years in the future from this story in Shibush as well. So I look forward to continuing with you. If you want to get any of the materials, so you can come up here and give me your email, and I'll send it to you. Or you can also register online at the website and access them yourselves. And if you haven't given them to me, please give me, those of you that are here, please give me your email address, and we'll send you the materials by email and update you about the next session. For those of you that are going to order, those of you online or those of you in the audience that are planning on doing some of the reading, so I'm sorry that you just have to hunt around for the books, unless you're interested in reading in Hebrew, which is of course recommended, and there are copies here. Oh, I didn't mention, they don't have them here. Shoken just published last year a new annotated edition of Sippur Pashut. Somebody that wants to brave the reading in Hebrew. There's an annotated edition of Sippur Pashut with vocabulary, and like when we read Shakespeare in high school, there were the annotated editions to help you make sense of it. So Shoken just put out an edition of, it's available in most of the stores, Stamatsky's, etc. So somebody that wants to brave the reading in Hebrew of Sippur Pashut might find that useful. For Oreach Natal Alun, you're on your own, but there are copies for sale here in Hebrew. Laila Tov. Yeah, so that old, Sarah, that old edition that's been updated and expanded.
Okay, wonderful. I showed you the cover. I tried to show you the cover.
I'm sorry, hold it up.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It has
right. So that's the old annotated. There were a few of those that were done. The books that were on the high school curriculum, or that is still in high school curriculum, were done up like that. And but this new edition is the annotations are greatly expanded.
Okay, well, I'll see if they have it. The Israel bookstore, because of this class, so one of the sales clerks her daughter lives across the street from you or something interesting. Anyway, they were going to order some copies in Hebrew.
Where are you?
In I'm not there, but in Brookline,
Boston.
They were going to order some extra copies at the Israel bookstore for this class.
Great,
okay,
thanks. Bye-bye. Miron, if you'd like, I can email it to you. I can email it to you, right? Give me your email right now. I'll send it to you. Right now. One moment. Oh. Mona Berman. I'm sending it to you right now. יפה. בבקשה. דן לאור. If you haven't given me your email, jot it down. Did you write down your email on the paper? Oh, great. Yeah, it's going out right now. It's in English. Yes, what's your email? At the desk, she'll quote it. Mittel. M-A-N-N. Tani Middleman. Okay. Does anyone else want a copy of that essay by Dan Miron that goes through Agnon's interactions with the novel? It's in English, yeah. What's the email? What's your email? Tell me your email. I'll send it right now. R-E-L-K-I-T at sympathetic.ca. Oh, you know, yeah. You look familiar.
I don't know how many of these I can attend. I just signed up on Rabbi Shira.
You could sign up on Rabbi Shiva and then get it online. Sending right now. Okay, sure.
I have one topic a year. It's harder to read.
And reading in Hebrew or in English? Reading in Hebrew, Agnon is going to be harder.
I did it a years ago. I do one in a year.
But it's better.
Although I disliked always one, so it's my best, but I thought I would dislike it. I did something last year.
Yeah,
I hate politics.
sure.
But I read another one, what a side on your read what you're doing. What's the shortest thing in